It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dharmesh Shah to the stage. Welcome, Dharmesh.
Hello, everyone.
So awesome to have you here. As many of you probably know, Dharmesh is the co-founder and CTO of HubSpot. In 2013, Dharmesh also published HubSpot's Culture Code, which we're going to spend some time talking about today, which is at almost 4 million downloads, I believe, which is incredible. And he's a very frequent speaker on startups, on inbound marketing, and company culture. And speaking of the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem, a thing I'm interested in is mafia company. We talk about this in venture world, and PayPal is a classic example, and HubSpot is now pretty established as what we call a mafia company. And for those who don't know the reference, it's when early employees of companies go off to spin out their own companies. And so it's become a bit of a system. There's great companies like Drift and Insight Squared, AppQs, Rolla, Wonderman is one that we're proud to back. All have been founded by early HubSpot folks. And it's interesting because some founders and leaders actually deliberately don't want that to happen. They want people just focused on what they're building here at this company and want to keep people focused on that. But I'm curious, what's your take on this? Was this intentional, and how has this sort of played into your hiring?
It was intentional, and I too fall into that camp that if I could wave a magic wand and get people to stay, the best people to stay forever, I would totally do that. I'm very self-serving that way. But one thing we recognize is that pragmatically, if we are looking to hire, which I think most founders are, hire onto the team, people that are entrepreneurially minded and creative and have that energy that that you need in a startup in its early stages. If you're going to recruit those kind of people, you have to be prepared for the fact that they're not going to work for you forever, that they're going to want to likely someday start something on their own. So in all the kind of recruiting meetings that I've done, that's kind of been part of the pitch, and it's true, which is if you have a startup idea that that's kind of burning a hole in your head, you should go do it, right? Like, we are completely supportive. Let us know if we can help. We'll look at investor decks and pitch decks and things like that. Great. If you're entrepreneurial, but you don't yet have an idea that you think is good enough for you to kind of devote your time to, spend some time at HubSpot. It'll be the equivalent of a startup MBA. You'll meet lots of cool people. You'll learn some things. You'll get exposed to a bunch of stuff that we're learning as we scale, and your odds of success will go up when you do start your startup. So, and that works well and has borne out to be true. And part of our kind of pitch is we don't want to just build a great company in the Boston area. We want to build great entrepreneurs. And we did intentionally do that in terms of those that were coming up. And we knew there were folks that were going to go off and do startups someday. We enjoy them while they're there. They contribute immense amount of value when they're there. And we stay friends. We invest in a lot of them. I personally invest in a lot of them. But it's worked out well. Yeah.
Well, it's a very open-minded and forward-looking view, which I think we need more and more of. So looking forward to more of the HubSpot Mafia and future ones as well, sort of the next gen.
Yeah.
So this brings me a little bit to culture. You're starting to talk about it a bit, and I'm very excited for this topic. I know it's one you're passionate about. Having looked at some of the work that you've done, the Culture Code document is amazing. So for those who haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. I've read all 128 slides of it, and clearly you're doing something right because back in 2021, not back in 2021, HubSpot was voted number 4 best place to work, which is an incredible accomplishment. Something to be really proud of. And also in 2020, it was voted best large company for women to work for, which I think is also something to be very proud of, particularly in this industry. So clearly the work that you're doing is paying off and doing something very right. I also think it's interesting in sort of my research in this is that, you were deemed sort of the definer and keeper of HubSpot's culture. And there's a lot of reasons why this is interesting. I think as an introvert, that's interesting. And also it's my understanding that you don't have direct reports. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep.
So it's sort of an interesting role for you. So I'm curious, how did you become responsible for this? And can you tell us about how you approached defining HubSpot's culture in the early days?
Yeah, I'll give you the short version of the backstory, which is, Brian, my co-founder, who's CEO of HubSpot, came back from one of these CEO group meetings that he went to regularly on a quarterly basis where he talked, and I always envisioned them sitting in a circle and singing CEO songs somewhere. But anyway, he came back from one of these, and the theme that day happened to be culture. And Brian's kind of take at that time was, oh well, culture is something we'll kind of work on as we get bigger, but right now we're so early stage, we're focused on building the product and selling the product and growing and doing all the things that a startup has to do. And his CEO group came down on him pretty hard. It's like, Brian, you don't get it. Like, there is nothing more important than culture. If you don't get that right, nothing else will matter over the long haul. So he kind of took that, and we had one of our founders dinners, which are 3 to 5 hour affairs involving alcohol, and he shared this with me. He's like, "Oh, I just had my CEO group thing." I'm like, "Oh, cool. What'd you learn?" And he's like, "Well, this culture thing is evidently really important." I'm like, "Great, so important." It's like, "Dharmesh, why don't you go do that?" I think I'm paraphrasing, but that was the exact term. Like, "Why don't you go do that?" I'm like, "I have no idea what that means." And of all the people at HubSpot, to choose to work on like these people issues, why pick the one that like least likes being around people, right? It seems like an orthodox choice. But I'm like, okay, fine. He had the CEO job. He was doing a ton of things. I'll carry my weight. And I treated it like I always do. I treated it like an engineering project. It's like, okay, well, we have to have some sort of culture, whatever it is. All I need to do is really document. Things seem to go really well. And I started with a survey, which asks the kind of standard NPS question on a scale of 0 to 10. How likely are you to recommend HubSpot as a place to work? And then the why, the qualitative question. A couple of things I learned here. Like as soon as I shared with the team at the time, the fact that I was kind of working on culture and thinking about culture, I had up until that point, probably even until now, the most negative visceral reaction from the team that I've ever had in my professional career, let alone HubSpot. People, he said things like, "Oh, so we're going to do this culture thing now, and then it's going to be like mission statements on the wall, and we're going to become like one of those companies." And then the thing that really got me was when one of the team members, who, by the way, I had hired all these people. These were not some random strangers that didn't know who I was, or what I was about. It's like, "Dharmesh, I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't think HubSpot's the kind of company I thought I joined." It's like, "You're killing me here." It's like, why such a deep, negative, visceral reaction? I was not expecting this. And it turns out people, when they think about culture, they think about this weird thing that big companies do to impose platitudes, and it's just the classic, like that's how it is. And in the startup world, and there's also this thinking, oh, it should be organic. Just the fact that we're talking about it makes it unauthentic and all this. There was a lot of stuff packed into it. Once we got over that, it got a lot better, a lot quicker. So the version 1 of the culture code deck was 16 slides, and it answered one question, which is, and the question I asked myself is like, okay, if I were to write a mathematical function or a computer science programming function to approximate the probability of success of any given HubSpotter, what are the coefficients of the things that are passed in? What are the parameters to that function, right? We might not know the weights or the relative, but what things would go in there? And I'm trying to like kind of boil it down to that. So what are the attributes, so to speak, of not good people, but people that are likely to succeed at HubSpot, which sometimes are different questions. But I was looking at like who's likely to succeed. That was kind of a probabilistic model. And we came back with a set of attributes that were highly correlated with what we consider to be the best, most successful, best fit people at HubSpot. And things like humility came out, things like transparency came out. So that's where the original kind of core values of HubSpot emerged. And it was interesting. So I published that deck internally only. And then the team came back, I think it was probably a couple of years later. It's like, "Dharmesh, that's been useful. It tells us the who. It doesn't really tell us how to make decisions or how to make trade-offs or do these things." And so that's when I started working on what is now the definitive culture code deck, which has been 128 slides since its inception, that new V2. And so my apologies to all those that had to go through that. But it's been interesting. So I thought of it, if I had now, like, okay, it's not simply a matter of a single function. If I were writing an operating system on which we could run HubSpot that would help us make these kind of heuristic decisions on how people make decisions, what would that look like? And so when people see the term culture code, they often think code means like a code of conduct or code of moral ethics. I was actually thinking code, like culture code, like actual Python code. As it turns out, that's not possible, since humans are very unpredictable. But anyway, so the document's done really well in terms of just articulating HubSpot's culture. One big lesson we learned is that it was useful to obviously have as an internal document. Releasing it to the world, which we give a hat tip to Netflix for, which did that, has been immensely helpful. And I would recommend all founders, you don't have to write a 128 slide deck, but you should be working more on culture than you likely are right now, at least amongst the founding team and the early team. Get a sense for what kind of company you're trying to become, what kinds of people will tend to do well there, and share that, especially with candidates, right? If you want them to self-select in and self-select out, right? So it should be this kind of document that helps you separate like the people that are going to be happy versus those that are probably not going to be happy at your company. And there's no perfect right or wrong answer. So this is who we are. If this feels like the place you would enjoy, then you should come look at us. If it doesn't, no harm, no foul. It's great. Anyway, sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but that's something I'm.
No, I love it. I think it's such a fascinating story. I love the reference of code and the path to design it, and then I think also the act of iterating it as you evolve is very valuable. And to your point, I think a lot of founders don't necessarily think about it early enough or don't quite know how to approach it.
Yeah.
I think you just
this as far as insights. Sorry to interrupt, but
no.
Bad short-term memory. My one piece of advice, this is a big kind of insight that I've had personally working on this now, and it fits, is that you should think of culture as a product, like literally a product, and the people that work in the company, your team, are the customers of that product. So as you're thinking about, if you think about it that way, a bunch of stuff starts to make sense. Like number one, you would never build a product without asking the customers what it is they're looking for from that product, number one.
Right.
Number two, you would never build a product and not see if customers were happy with the product or not, by surveys or usage or however you measure it. You would never build a product and say, oh, that was fun, I'm done with that product now. No product is ever done. So, like one of the mistakes people make is like, oh, we've got this culture, now our job is to preserve this culture for eternity for as long as we can. Nope, just like a product, it needs to iterate, it needs to fit whatever the use cases are at a particular point in the company's evolution. So the idea is not to protect and preserve the culture. The idea is to optimize the culture as you go so it continues to serve as a well-functioning operating system or a set of heuristics, whatever you want to kind of think of it as. But that metaphor holds remarkably well. Every time I poked and prodded at it, oh, is it really? Yes. And now if you look at it, it's like some of the things we've had happen over the last year or 2 years, global pandemic, social justice issues. It helps you answer a bunch of questions, which is, okay, well, as it turns out, like, oh, should we be a remote company? Should we be a hybrid company? What should we be? Part of the answer should be asking your customers, because that's a part of culture. And it might be that you have one of those companies that everybody wants to be remote. Everybody was miserable having to come into the office anyway. You don't know until you survey. And just like a product, you wouldn't always do exactly what the customer said, right? Like you're solving for the long-term interest of theirs as well. But you should at least listen. You don't have to follow the direction, but you should at least listen to the advice and listen to the feedback. And so one of the things we've learned is that on the list of features, which has been relatively stable for a long time, is the flexibility feature in terms of feature requests has gone up, which is not surprising. It's not counterintuitive at all. It's very intuitive, that's one of the top features people are looking for in a company culture is like, I'm taking care of elder parents, or I have kids, or I have this, it's like, if you can give them flexibility, that will often trump titles in terms of, I'd rather be a senior director at a company that gives me the flexibility than a VP somewhere else. People actually do these kind of calculations, analyses in their head, and they favor features. If I haven't done a conjoint analysis yet, but if I did, I think it would probably pop up as being one of the key ones.
I love that, thinking of it as a feature, and also the product framing. And I'm looking at the chat. I think it's really resonating with people as they think about this. And I do think people are curious about the new normal and future state. I read that something that you wrote back actually in 2019, the pajama principle: success is proportional to the degree to which you let people stay in their pajamas. And if I look at your 2020, I think that's probably quite true. So I think that the flexibility is something that really resonates with folks, and as they're thinking about what's ahead, I think that's an important one for people to think about and internalize. If you're open to it, I'm sure we could talk about this topic for hours, but I'd love to shift gears a little bit just to make sure we can cover some things. So Dharmesh, if you were given a chance to go back in time and build HubSpot again, what would you do differently?
The one thing that jumps to mind, because this is on the list of like top 3 biggest professional mistakes I've made in my career, I would start working on culture sooner. So it was several years in before that conversation with Brian happened where we started getting intentional about culture. And part B is recognizing the importance of diversity and building out the early team. Candidly, that thought had just not even crossed my mind, right? It was not a deliberate, oh, we're going to hire people that look just like us, but we ended up hiring people that, everyone pretty much had an MBA, all came out of MIT Sloan, not all, like 8 out of the first 10 hires were MIT Sloan grads, alternating years. And we hired, for lack of a better term, in network out of convenience. And we should have made a more deliberate effort. It's much easier to do that and solve for diversity, and it has long-range positive impact as we're now learning as an industry, as a society, the importance of that. And it's really hard to fix later, right? Once you're at scale, to say, okay, well, now we're going to try and go back and pay off what I think of as culture debt. When you have this homogenous organization where everybody like everybody else, and in technology debt, the good news is if you incur technology debt, most of the time you can refactor that piece of code that you took shortcuts on, and you can kind of pay that debt off. It's like, okay, well, I know we took a shortcut, we had to at the time we needed the product out the door. Culture debt is much more insidious, right? So there's no check you can write, there's no code you can rewrite, because the roots of that are sometimes very deeply planted, right? It's like, then first you have to convince the organization that it's important. Then you have to say, okay, well, what does that mean actually? Like, what do you actually do? And then you have to have the patience to say, okay, well, we spent, a decade not being as mindful of this as we should have been. It's going to take decades, plural, to actually get it to likely where we want it to be. But you have to start the journey anyway. So my piece of advice would be, think about diversity early. It'll be much easier to think about, even though you may not actually get it. At least you plant the seed in your team's head that that's important, right? It's like, oh, we look to hire for diversity. I know the last 2 or 3 weren't as diverse as we would have liked, but otherwise, if you don't even talk about it, then everybody just assumes that doesn't really matter. That's the signal that's being sent when you don't do it. So at least give it effort, give it time, give it consideration.
It's one of the top things that we hear, and I like the framing of culture debt. But you touched on something that's hard, particularly for early stage startups trying to go fast. And oftentimes what we've seen is getting that diversity in earlier sometimes can take longer because of the pipeline challenges and things like that.
Yep.
You said just talking about this is a good first step. How do you think startups should think about that trade-off in sort of time versus really investing in this effort? Because it can be challenging.
Yeah, so there's a spectrum here, right? The ideal state is you actually hire for diversity and you do it, right? Whatever time it takes. Next step down is you make attempts at it, and it should be measurable. It's like, okay, well, did we? We have something at HubSpot called the Rooney Rule, where for every hire, above a certain level, there has to be a diverse candidate as part of the pool. We had to have at least considered someone. Now, they may or may not have been the right fit. We're not forcing anyone to hire anyone, but so it's like going down the spectrum. So ideally, you try to hire. If not, you at least put the processes in place that make it possible to hire. And yes, it takes an investment. And yes, hiring pipelines are a problem. But at a bare minimum, I'm not saying you should, beat yourself up over it, but you should beat yourself up over it. It's like, okay, we tried. It was 1, it was 2, it was understandable at 3, but we're at 10 people now, and we still have not had a single one.
Right.
Something's not right. I don't think we're trying hard enough. Let's look a little deeper. Maybe make the sacrifice to say the next one will be more deliberate, and we'll take our time with it. Yeah, there's going to be negative trade-offs, but there are definitely negative trade-offs on the other side too. So
yeah, no, I think the articulation of the culture debt is a great way to think about what the negative trade-offs are on the flip side.
Yeah.